thank Walnut Street Inn for hosting us once again. So thank you very much to Walnut Street Inn. Thank you all for being here. This is our first Behind the Baton since October. We didn't have one in November and December because they were Pops concerts. So we're happy to be back in our classical programming, and most of all, we want to welcome my friend, the wonderful pianist Jon Nakamatsu, to Springfield. So what I like to do in Behind the Baton when we have an artist is to just have a conversation. I do the pre-concert talk before the concert where I'll talk about the music. So we don't have to talk about the music very much. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about piano. So Jon, as many of you know, especially if you've seen our advertising and our promo, is, I guess you're the only American to win the Van Cliburn since the first.
Since there were two.
Two, okay.
Before me.
Two before you?
Yeah.
Okay, but you're the last American to win the Van Cliburn competition. Jon and I grew up a couple miles from each other. But we didn't know each other, I didn't know you. But you've heard the story, but I'll tell the story again. My mom is a piano teacher. She was friends with your teacher.
Yes, I knew that.
And remind me your teacher's name.
Marina Derryberry.
Marina Derryberry, that's right. So my mom was friends with Marina, and when I was 10, maybe 10 or 11, you're a couple years older, I think, my mom got a call from Mrs. Derryberry saying, "I've got this kid, you've got to come see him play." Do you remember this? You may not remember this.
I have no idea.
She said, you've got to come see this kid. And so one Saturday, my mom went over, and I don't know if it was your lesson or if it was a recital or something, but she saw you play.
Wow.
And she came home and said, "I've just seen the next Andre Watts, the best kid performer I've ever seen."
Wow.
And I sat there and went, okay. Actually, I didn't, because piano wasn't my ultimate goal, certainly. But she said, right then, she knew how good you were going to be.
Wow.
And then here's another story. When we were in college, we were at the same university, but we didn't know each other there. You were a German major.
Yep.
I was a music major in political science. And then one night, so the good practice rooms were in Braun Music Center upstairs. They were the soundproof, were fairly new at the time, practice rooms. The really bad practice rooms were down in the basement of Dinkelspiel. They smelled like mold and mildew. You could hear right through the walls. They were not very soundproof at all. And so one night I went up to the practice rooms and everyone was taken up, so I had to go down to the basement. I went down to the basement, I started practicing, and then I heard this piano, and it was unlike, I said, who is that? I've never heard anybody play that well. And then I walked out, and one of my friends was there. I said, "Who's there?" And they said, "Oh, that's Jon Nakamatsu." I said, "He's here?" And so that was my second intersection.
You didn't come in. I didn't pay for those. Like, I snuck in. I would just go like this to every practice room door to see which one was unlocked, and then I would go, because I couldn't pay for it. So I would just take a piano and then close the door.
So that's why you went to the bad practice rooms downstairs?
Well, yeah, I was hiding.
Yeah. Anyway.
Very shameful.
Then the next time I hear about you, you've won the Van Cliburn competition.
That was many years later.
Oh, that long. So tell us a little bit about just that progression, because you were not part of the piano mafia, right? The conservatory teachers who were part of the circuit, who their students competed, they judged. So tell us a little bit about kind of going from not being a music major to the piano circuit. How did that work for you?
Well, I should say that I was, from the very start, piano was kind of my thing. I asked my parents for a piano. They did not want me to take lessons or force me to. I saw a piano when I was 4, and immediately I told my mother, that's what I want. Get one. And she said no. Because like any smart parent, they thought, well, he'll give it up in a week or a month, and so we're not taking up our whole living room for this. But they did for Christmas buy me a toy organ. And I played with that, and apparently I was spending hours at this thing and kind of learning how to play music on my own, and my father taught me a little bit of notes. And when they saw how much time I was actually spending at the instrument, they said, okay, when you're 6, we will buy a piano, but you have to start taking lessons. And on the second lesson, my teacher, who is your mother's friend, told my mother, he's different. And my mother said, well, what's wrong with him? My parents, not being at all musical or musicians, although they love music, were kind of part of this education. And you know, by the second lesson, I was also hooked. And I knew this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, not really knowing as a 6-year-old what that actually meant. But I was a very serious student, and so by the time I was 10, this person who taught me my first scales was then seeing me about 4 times a week for 5 or 6 hours at a time. And that's how I spent my youth. But my condition to being able to do this from my parents was that I always had to do well in school, and that was how they allowed me to play the piano. They said, if you're a good student, you can do this. At the moment you do poorly in school, we're stopping. So, and that was easy for me too, because I like school, and so this kind of was my dual life. But I started, you know, kind of as you probably did, with just the neighborhood recitals and, you know, the local competitions, and then you went to something a little bit more regional. And so I did all of that. I did it through the Music Teachers Association. But I also knew that, you know, as high school, it's kind of one thing, but then you get into college and you start entering things that are beyond your area, beyond the country. The first international competition was probably when I was 19. And then I started losing everything, you know, where I just wasn't let in anywhere. And it was just, whereas my youth was spent kind of winning everything, my early 20s was spent losing everything and going to auditions and not even passing first rounds, and, you know, sending materials and actually being told, this is never going to happen, don't do it, you know. So that was my experience, and because of that, because I had such a wonderful education, I felt like I could do something academic in school that was somehow related to music. And so that's why German.
That's why German?
German, French, languages, literature, but particularly German, because so much of the core repertoire that I play as a pianist is Central European. And I thought this would be great. Plus, as I got older, every year I thought this may never actually happen for me. So I needed an exit strategy. And that one of those ideas was that if by my 30s nothing had happened with music, I would actually leave it and maybe go into linguistics and go into academics, because that was the other interest that I had, you know, learning languages and then studying linguistics actually really fascinated me. So that probably would have been my alternate career. But at the same time, after college, not having, you know, a career in music yet, I needed something to do, so I actually started teaching high school German, and I went back to school, or I continued school, graduate school, to get a degree in secondary ed. So I was a high school German teacher for 6 years, and actually at graduate school at Stanford is where I met my wife, who was still in secondary education after all these years. You know, that's kind of how it went.
You know, I want to hear a little bit about the failure, because the Springfield Symphony has a concerto competition, and it's a young artist competition sponsored by Judy Hallam. We get we've had terrific young players come in. And I say this with the utmost of affection. It's kind of disgusting how much these kids win. I mean, you know, these are the ones who are winning these competitions all the time, kind of coming out of the factories of jewelry. They're wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean that at all negatively. But what I wonder is, when you get told you should find something else to do, or this is not going to happen for you. How did you continue? I mean, that's a very disheartening thing to hear.
Yeah, and especially as a young person, when you really don't know how to react to something like that. You know, my parents were very realistic, so I had that. I had a side that was very practical and quite grounded in reality. So I didn't have grand fantasies about it has to be this way. But I did know what I wanted to do, and it was very difficult for professionals, even some very, very famous people whose names I won't mention, tell me, you're not good enough, or you don't play well, or you'll never make it, and they do that. But I think one of the reasons that I could survive that was that I had a teacher who was always there and would be like the mentor, counselor, who was helping me understand where a lot of this information was coming from. And I think that's what you have to help. It's a very delicate balance. Now that I teach some students also through the conservatory, you know, to help them understand all the aspects of criticism, not to just ignore it or, you know, put yourself above it. I mean, that's absolutely not the point. But to understand that there are many aspects of what they will hear in their lifetime. And I think that's part of the test. Because what happens when you're really in the career, as you know, is that suddenly all of these losses or all of the things that were private failures become very public. And that means like you can go play your best in a city and get panned in the press. And everybody reads that. And that goes around. And you know, and that's difficult in a different way, you know. And I once, I was lucky enough to early on to meet Emmanuel X, and he told me there's never a moment in his career that he's felt like he's beyond touch. Meaning that even somebody who spent his whole life playing concerts never feels like he actually made it. Like he could relax into the career. That he's always thinking something, you know, something could take him down, and it could be the last concert, and I just have to survive to the next day. And actually hearing that, it's all about building perspective for a young person. And that's what I try to tell my students. It's, you know, take what you can from criticism, but know that if you let this break you, that's kind of the end. Because what happens in the real world is far more harsh than what somebody might tell you in private. You know, what they're not willing to say in public, but will, you know, call you over and say, you should quit. You know, look you in the face and tell you you're not good enough. So.
You gave a kind of famous speech on failure at the Van Cliburn, right? Or was it the amateur Van Cliburn? Yeah. That I actually quote sometimes, because when we do concerto competitions and I judge and I have to, you know, you have to declare a winner. I mean, that was. Do people still talk to you about that? Because it's on YouTube.
All the time, and I think they're shocked when they look at me and they say, "Wow, you aged." But I think that's the hardest thing. It's really so complicated because I remember going to competitions and just losing and losing and losing, and then think, you know, when am I going to catch a break? You know, when is this going to happen? And there are all kinds of things that you have to work through. But I also think that helped me more than if I won a major competition when I was in my early 20s. Because at the time that I won Cliburn, I was already 27, and that was late. That's very late for a competition win. Most people are winning 24, 23. But I felt kind of as an older person, one that had a real job, and one that also kind of left the whole profession, that my perspective was somewhat healthier. Because there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people who win competitions every year, and how many actually do you know today? You know, not that many. But I would say also that, you know, in that creation of perspective, every profession is like that. Like, how many people do you know start off trying to become medical professionals, and then how many people actually become doctors, and how many people are at the top of their profession? You know, everything kind of gets. It's in everything. It's not just what we do. It's just what we do is so public, and it becomes such a thing, as an individual. So to keep healthy balances, I think is difficult.
How do you contextualize for yourself the difference between competitions, which are helpful for your career, and actual music making, which has very little to do with competition at all?
I think in the end, because students often think when they prepare for a competition that they have to prepare differently, and I did too. And in a certain way, maybe you have to, right? Because if I play a recital by myself, nobody is going to stay at some point, thank you, next, right? They may never buy another ticket, but they won't.
They're not going to cut you off.
They're not going to cut you off in a way that makes that moment so painful. In a competition, and especially if you are trying to get your career kind of going, there's so much riding on that event. And so maybe that does have to be dealt with on some level, but I think fundamentally you just have to go and play the way you play. Because if you try to please all the people who are on the jury or in the audience, or you think this person plays like this, so you have to play like this, you end up not having any sense of conviction. So I just tell students, if you're going to do this, that's great, but you just have to be prepared to accept a no and to be okay with that. And if they can do that, I think that bodes well for the future, because the whole profession, the arts profession, you're talking about dance. I mean, how many dancers go to audition after audition? Actors, it's audition after audition. No, maybe. And so, if you don't experience that as well, I think that you're really not prepared for the real world, which is that times, a big number.
This is fascinating. We can talk a lot about it, but let's talk about music a little bit. We're playing Rachmaninoff together on this concert. I'm very excited about that. I guess one more reference. You won the Clyburn with Rock 3, right? The third concerto. We're playing the second concerto. I love this piece so much. I'm excited. This is the first time we're going to do it together. We played Rock 3, but not Rock 2. We're playing the second Rock. We say Rock 2, right? That's the second Rachmaninoff piano concerto. This is probably my favorite piano concerto. You picked it this time.
Did I?
Yeah. Because I suggested the Paganini variations, and you came back and said, "How about the second piano concerto?"
Because there was another orchestra that wanted this too.
Yeah.
Around the same time.
Right. And I said, "Great, let's do that." I mean, I'm happier to do the second than the Paganini, to be honest. So what is it about Rachmaninoff? I mean, you chose that for competition. You choose it to perform. What is it about Rachmaninoff that you especially love?
Well, there are certain composers who really, they were pianists who wrote for pianists. There are other composers who were, played the piano or maybe even were pianists, but weren't necessarily writing for pianists. And it's I think the easiest way to say this is Rachmaninoff was creating music for his own tours. He was creating his music not only because he wanted to show what an incredible composer he was, but also that nobody could ever play this stuff. And at the time, a lot of this was considered unplayable, and now, every 4-year-old can play this piece. But before, it was just not, it was unheard of. So there's that, and when you play Rachmaninoff, it's so difficult because there's so much going on, but at the same time, you feel like everything's idiomatic. Everything fits. Everything's ergonomic. There are composers like Dvorak, often Brahms, Tchaikovsky, where you feel that they don't really care how you feel as a pianist. They're writing kind of symphonically or with big musical concepts. And so Dvorak has the most awkward passage. You never know because it sounds great, but we're struggling and thinking, this is not pianistic at all. And Brahms is sometimes like that, where you think it just is so symphonic, this really isn't a piano piece. And yet, it is some of the most incredible music that we have. That I enjoy playing it all, but Liszt is another one where he's considered to have written some of the most difficult music, but you feel like he really understood the instrument.
Now, Rachmaninoff was giant, right? 6'5" or 6'6". I mean, he's huge. And his hand, what was his?
It was almost 12, which is double the reach that I have about. This is an octave, and he could reach beyond that. I mean, and so could Van Cliburn. And so the only taste of this was that when Van Cliburn comes to you, you're almost. It's like this octopus just kind of descends on your head. And when you watch somebody like that play, they don't move. It's like they're doing this and I'm doing this. It's an amazing thing to see that.
So do you have to come up with techniques? I mean, are there sort of standard received techniques of how does a person with smaller hands do it? Or do you have to come up with your own way to accommodate the fact that he wrote for a reach that was much larger than yours?
Well, so what's interesting about Rachmaninoff is that, yes, he had huge hands, but the music doesn't require you, except for the beginning of this piece, doesn't really require stretches that are like constant tenths or constant huge chords that only he could reach.
Which actually Tchaikovsky does, right?
A little bit more.
Yeah.
A little bit more. And I've often wondered if that was a challenge to all of us, you know, that I'm going to write this for you, but you're still not going to be able to play it. there was a little bit of an ego thing with composers trying to just write the hardest music possible. I mean, that went back far before Rachmaninoff. But the one thing that a bigger hand would help with, in this case, it's power and accuracy. I think those are the two things that really I have to figure out. And because I only know this, that's all I base myself. The one thing that you will hear is in the opening of the very first thing you'll hear when I play is that I start alone. And there are these chords that if you hear Rachmaninoff play them, he plays them all the notes played together. All the notes. And it sounds amazing. And I can't do that.
Hardly anybody can.
Well, there's some people who can, but so I choose to just break the left hand. Instead of doing this, I do the bum. And so that you have that, if some people say, well, that's awful, you know, what can I do? But there are very few things. There are other places in the concerto, many more in the third concerto also, that I think, gosh, if I had a bigger hand, all of this would be so much easier. I mean, just even to grip it. And what the proof of that was, there was a teacher at SMU in Dallas who specializes in reduced keyboards. And so she has these keyboards made that are smaller than the standard keyboard that fit into Steinways. Why this hasn't caught on in the whole world, I have no idea. But I got to play these different, and for the first time I could play Baton. It was like, I can't describe the feeling, except that for a second I felt like a giant. Like in the Tchaikovsky concerto where you have these octaves, and I could just go, like that was a whole education in why this music was written. It wasn't written for me.
It's like lowering the basketball hoop and suddenly you can dunk the ball.
That's right. That's right. And, you know.
But that's very interesting. Why don't they have, is it just because pianos are pianos? But I mean, there's no reason the keys can't be slightly narrower. I mean, on almost any other instrument, they can make them different sizes, and different fingerboards are slightly different sized.
One would think, but I think the powers that be just basically make all of us deal with it. I think it's hard. Once you have something that's pretty standard in an industry, it's really hard to move, like a company like Steinway, to make a variety of reduced keyboards. When they feel that every millimeter is planned for a reason. Like everything is so calculated. I think it's tough. But that said, and I didn't want to stay too long because I didn't want to get sad. So I played them for a while, and I thought, okay, I need to not do this. But she did say that you can go back and forth. That was the interesting, that your brain is able to somehow understand like size difference right away. And that was true. I could go from one piano back to the regular one, and it felt harder, but it wasn't like I was missing anything.
Interesting. What's the difference? You do a lot of chamber music. You have a duo partner, Jon Nakamatsu, who has played here in Springfield. He came and played a concerto with us. When our kids were little, John and John was confusing. So you're piano John, and Jon Nakamatsi's clarinet John. So you're still piano John in our household. And so you do a lot of chamber music. What's the difference for you between solo recital, chamber music performance, and a concerto performance with the orchestra? What do you have to do or feel differently about those various things?
Well, I love it all. I mean, one of the nice things for pianists is that we get to do all of those kinds of things, and our repertoire is huge. It's of all the instruments, it has the most varied, wonderful repertoire. I think, with the exception of string quartets, I think there's nothing like it. But for example, a concerto versus a recital. Tomorrow night, or this weekend, I'll play one piece. A recital would be 3 of those, 3 concertos in one evening, and I'm alone. So one is almost like a sprint, and one is kind of like a marathon. And even just the level of energy you have to kind of terrace during a recital is different than you would in a concerto. A concerto is kind of all out from the start. And that's the nature of the beast. I mean, the concerto is a very theatrical, really it's a show, as well as an oral experience. Whereas a recital, it's kind of all about just, one thing from the first note leading to the last note of the evening.
So do you find the concerto a little easier?
In terms of preparation, sometimes.
What about in terms of pressure in the performance?
Sometimes worse.
Yeah.
Because you're not just worrying about yourself. And you could be playing along, and then when a section is, half a beat behind you for a long time, and then you're trying not to forget, and then somebody else is ahead, and you're trying to move up ahead, and the conductor can be in one place, but the orchestra is somewhere else, or somebody plays too loud or plays a wrong note. I've had that too. That's really just entire sections playing wrong, and you're thinking.
So on the other hand, I had a pianist once play the entire recapitulation in the wrong key. So it does happen both ways.
It's all scary, and if you're in total control, the worst that could happen is I could stop and start over.
Right. In a recital.
In a recital. In a concerto, you really can't do that because everybody's going, and they're not going to wait for you. So there's that, but there's for every negative thing there's a positive. That sometimes when I'm like really just they're going and going and going, and I need a break, I could just kind of like, oh, well, they'll take over for there. So there are also breaks in the piece, not so many in the Rachmaninoff, but in Beethoven, for example, they play, I play, they play, I play, and so you get a little bit of a rest. There's a chance to regroup. Not so much.
You have very rare moments of respite in the Rachmaninoff, and they're short.
Yeah. The recital can be kind of the most daunting of all presentations because from the first note, it's only you. And sometimes after playing a lot of concertos or chamber music, it's so refreshing to get on the stage and just have to worry about myself, but it's also, 100 times more scary.
Yeah.
One, because there's a lot more music to remember, and I have to remember it all. But also, just the preparation time and all of that. With chamber music, in some ways it's wonderful too, simply because you're interacting with musicians as individuals. Whereas in orchestra, you feel like you are acting with them as individuals, but everything is funneled typically through one person, and that's the conductor. And so that collaboration feels like almost kind of a triangle, where there's me, there's you, and there's this big group where at certain times different people interact, but at best it's all being funneled through one person, and that's where I think the success of concertos lies. But that's also kind of true of chamber music. So that's that connection.
Let me ask you, so we're almost out of time. I hate to even say that because this has been so fascinating. And we'll go over 5 minutes, but then we rescheduled Jon to, he wasn't going to rehearse with us until tomorrow, but with the weather, we decided we're going to just have him play with us tonight just to make sure that regardless of what happens tomorrow, we get that rehearsal in. So let me ask you the unfair question, which is, do you have your encore planned, and do you know what it is? Would you reveal to us what it is? Okay, then we can make suggestions. So, Alice, what's your request?
I know they're on your list already. I mean, you've done the fantasy impromptu.
Oh, okay.
And then, he's like, I wasn't gonna do that. And there's a Joplin that you can play on once.
Okay.
That was your,
And,
one of your dad's favorite pieces, that Joplin rag that you...
Oh, the entertainer.
Was it the entertainer?
There's a
Oh,
soloist.
Soloist, yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that.
And
Yeah, me
Joplin's
too.
from
You
Missouri.
know, Joplin's from
so-
Missouri.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah.
Just saying.
So, if you want to do 2 encores, no one would object. I'm sure. All right, so let me ask you, does anybody, we've got 5 minutes, does anybody have questions?
So during the 6 years you were teaching German, what were you doing piano-wise?
Well-
How much practice?
Sometimes none. Sometimes weekends, that's what weekends were for. But the one thing I'd say is that my students really never knew me as a pianist. And they knew what I did. And they thought our German teacher has this weird hobby where he goes away to play concerts or competitions. But and all I ever did for them in class was play Christmas songs or something like that. But so I really was a teacher for many years, but I needed goals so that I was very, very in shape all the time. And I think, going to a competition every year, doing as many performances as I could kind of set up for myself, having deadlines, forced me to practice. But it also just, my life was different. I did that, and I did school, and I wasn't married when I was in my 20s. That all came later. I didn't have a son until later. I didn't, so my life was really focused on 2 things, and there was no time to do anything else. And that's kind of the life that I chose at that time.
Then a follow-up question, then what caused you, or what led you up to then saying, I'm going to audition for bagpiper?
Well, like I said, I was in competitions all through that time. And I had actually applied to the '93 competition, and I wasn't allowed in. I didn't even pass the screening. So I didn't ever get to Fort Worth. I screened and was rejected. So 4 years later, at the next competition, it was going to be my last try. And I had, in the meantime, the one thing that happened that was a big step up for me was I won the United States Chopin competition. And that gave me New York and DC debuts. And so that kind of, it got me press. And so suddenly I had something to show them. It was like, okay, look at this. And I think because of that, 2 years before the Clyburn, that may have helped me. Plus, I think 4 years just, I thought this was my last chance, I'm going to do it. And I took the time off of work and went to Fort Worth and screened, and I got in. And so it wasn't like I decided, it was what was allowed to happen. And why I started touring was because I won. It wasn't really that, I think I'll start touring. Just, I wish it could have been that, but careers don't happen that way typically. The exceptions do, but for most of us, that's not how it.
Because you get a certain number of guaranteed gigs from the win, right?
That's right. That's right. And in my year, once every American was eliminated except me, all the presenters in the United States said, who took winners, would take any winner. No, we want this guy because his story will sell tickets. And that's really the economics of what we do. The night before, no one would have come. The day after, there's a reason to sell a house. And so it's not necessarily about who you are as an artist. And that's, again, goes back to how we talk about this with students. The perspective issue of who you are and where you are in your development is really the most important thing.
Other questions?
Is that a Band-Aid on your finger?
Should we be worried about this?
Will that be healed by Saturday?
No. But so you know, when I play these pieces, there's the amount of this that happens. So my finger, eventually when it's dry, my fingers start splitting open, especially right at the point where I contact the most. And in fact, I was in another Springfield once, that reminds me, where I was playing Tchaikovsky concerto, and in the middle of the concerto, my fingers split open, and then it was just bleeding all over. So my colleague in the order, they were horrified. They thought I was dying. But somehow we made it through. But the solution for this weekend is to wear a Band-Aid as I practice and all this. But a very dear colleague taught me it'll be covered with super glue for the concert. And then I can take off the Band-Aid. But it's only going to last that. It will only last one Rachmaninoff concerto, and then
And 2 encores, or
so it's actually hurting right now. So
how much are you still practicing?
as much as possible, but it's not as consistent as you'd think, because so much of life is on the road, and then when I'm home, I have to be home.
Right. Yeah, and having a child dramatically changes your time.
Yes, I have an 8-year-old. Yeah, he's 8.
No.
So, and that, if there's one thing I want to be above all else, it's a dad. I just I love what I do. I love that we're going to do this. But my love is just, that has, and that it happened when it happened is just so fulfilling and so wonderful for me. But, so I want to do that. I want to go to the soccer game. I want to just be with him. But, I do a lot of practicing now. So I probably was in there at 9 o'clock. I took a little lunch break, and I was there after we worked, and I will probably practice. And sometimes I practice in the intermissions of concerts that I've just played in. So, am I before the intermission?
No, you're after the
Oh,
intermission
well,
tonight, or tomorrow. Sorry,
I can't play in the intermission.
Yeah. And one more question. Anybody?
Not a question, but another suggestion on the encore. A river flows in you.
Oh, I don't think I know that. What is?
It's a Japanese, what's his name? I'll look it up.
Oh, I have to look it up.
Yeah. This would be
It's a little bit more like modern, where it's a lot of like TikTok and Instagram musicians. That's like the thing right
Cool
now.
people.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful music, but
Yeah, but it probably won't be Saturday night, is it?
Come next time.
John, thank you so much for I will just tell all of you, working with John is just a joy. It's so easy, and he's known in the music world as being the nicest guy in the music world. So you should all know that about him. So thank you for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to Walnut Street Inn, and then we're gonna have to run. So
I do, yes.
yeah, thank you all.